The stagecoach lurched one final time, its worn leather straps groaning a weary complaint as the wheels settled into the dust of what passed for a main street. For Alara, the cessation of movement was more jarring than the endless, bone-shaking rhythm of the journey itself. She had been in motion for so long, carried westward by steam and horse, that the sudden stillness felt like a fall. She pressed a hand to the grimy window, peering out at the town that was to be the beginning of her new life. Dust Devil Creek, Montana Territory. It was less a town and more a wound in the hide of the world, a raw collection of unpainted clapboard buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, crushing emptiness that surrounded them. The sky was the first thing that truly stole her breath. It was not the soft, hazy blue of a Boston summer, but a pale, washed-out sheet of color, immense and utterly indifferent. It stretched from one end of the world to the other, barely troubled by a few thin wisps of cloud. Beneath it, the mountains tore at the horizon, their peaks jagged and cruel like broken teeth. The wind, a constant and mournful presence, swept down from those peaks, carrying a scent she could not yet name, a dry, clean mix of pine, dust, and something wild and profoundly lonely. It slipped through the cracks of the coach and touched her cheek like a cold, spectral hand. Slowly, she gathered herself, smoothing the wrinkles from the skirt of her traveling dress. The deep blue serge had been her finest, but weeks of travel had faded its color and left it limp and weary. It felt foreign here, a relic of a softer, greener world. Back in Boston, this dress had represented a certain faded gentility. Here, against the raw timber and trodden earth, it made her feel like a wilting flower transplanted into a desert. At not quite 20 years of age, she was a mail-order bride, a piece of human cargo bartered for by her impoverished family. The arrangement, conducted through a series of terse, formal letters, was for her passage to be paid in exchange for her hand in marriage. It was a desperate gamble, a flight from a future of quiet decay and genteel poverty. Inside her, a cold knot of trepidation warred with a tiny, flickering flame of hope, a hope for a life that was her own, for a future that held more than the slow, suffocating decline she had left behind. The coach door was pulled open, and she descended the steep steps into the biting wind. She clutched the handle of her small, worn valise, its leather scuffed and its corners soft from use. It contained everything she owned in the world. Around her neck, tucked beneath the high collar of her dress, lay her only true treasure, a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside, protected by a circle of glass, was a miniature portrait of her mother, her face serene and her eyes kind. Alara's fingers found its familiar shape, the cool metal a small, solid anchor in this overwhelming new reality. The people of Dust Devil Creek moved with a purpose that made her feel frivolous and ornamental. Men in dusty hats and worn denim paused to watch her, their faces weathered to the texture of old leather, their gazes brief, hard, and appraising. They looked at her the way a farmer might look at a new piece of livestock, judging her worthiness, her durability. The women she saw were just as hard. Their expressions shuddered, their hands chapped and raw from work. In their eyes, she saw no welcome, only a weary curiosity. She felt like a porcelain doll set down in a blacksmith's shop, fragile and utterly out of place, expecting to be shattered at any moment. The world here was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the smells of horsehide, wood smoke, and hot metal from the smithy down the street. The incessant creak of wagon wheels turning in the dirt was the town's heartbeat, a slow, grinding rhythm. Dust, fine as flour, coated her tongue and settled in a gritty film on her skin. But it was the space that was the most terrifying, the most awe-inspiring. The vast, empty plains rolled away in every direction, an ocean of brown grass and gray sagebrush that dwarfed the small cluster of buildings. The sheer scale of it made her feel small and insignificant, a tiny speck of life in an enormous, uncaring world. This was not a land that nurtured. It was a land that one survived. She stood by the coach, a solitary figure in worn finery, waiting for the man whose name she knew only from a single, short letter. Jedediah. She expected a man to step from the crowd, perhaps with a hesitant smile or a polite nod. But the minutes stretched on, and the curious glances of the townspeople turned to knowing whispers. A flush of shame crept up her neck. She was to be the bride, and her groom had not even bothered to meet her. Finally, a man detached himself from the shadows of the blacksmith's shop and approached. He was built like one of the mountains that loomed over the town, broad and solid, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun and wind. Soot was ingrained in the lines of his hands and creased the corners of his eyes. This was not Jedediah. "You the woman for Jedediah?" the man asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of pleasantry. Elara straightened her shoulders, forcing a dignity she did not feel. "I am Miss Elara Gable." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if confirming a piece of freight. "Silas, I am the blacksmith." He made no move to take her valise. "He is not one for town. Said he would meet you out at the Justice of the Peace's place. It is on the way to his ranch." The explanation was offered without apology. A simple statement of fact. It did nothing to soothe the cold dread that was beginning to blossom in Elara's chest. Her intended was a man who could not be bothered to ride a few miles to greet his future wife. Silas gestured with his head toward a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched nearby. "My wagon. I am to take you." The ride out of Dust Devil Creek was conducted in a heavy, suffocating silence. The sparse collection of buildings quickly fell away, leaving them alone in the vast, open wilderness. The landscape grew more imposing with every turn of the wheels, more desolate. They traveled through endless plains of gray-green sagebrush and pale, sun-bleached bunchgrass. The wind was relentless, whipping loose strands of her carefully pinned hair across her face and chilling her to the bone despite the thin afternoon sun. She pulled her shawl tighter, but it offered little protection against the pervasive cold. They came to a river, a shallow, stone-strewn ribbon of water that cut through the prairie. Silas did not hesitate, urging the horses directly into the current. The water, shockingly cold, swirled around the wheels, its rushing sound the only noise in the immense quiet. As they climbed the opposite bank, Elara looked up at a nearby ridge. A lone coyote stood there, a fleeting, sharp silhouette against the endless sky. It watched them for a long moment, its head cocked, before melting back into the landscape as if it had never been there. The sight sent a profound shiver of isolation through her, a deep, primal understanding of just how alone she was. This was its world, not hers. She turned to the stoic man beside her, the silence suddenly unbearable. "Mr. Silas," she began, her voice sounding small and thin in the open air. "Can you tell me of Mr. Jedediah?" Silas kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his hands steady on the reins. He seemed to consider the question for a long time. "He is a hard worker," he said at last. The words clipped. Elara waited for more, but nothing came. She tried again. "Is he a good man?" Another long pause. "He keeps to himself." His evasiveness was more unsettling than any direct criticism could have been. It spoke of things unsaid, of a story he was unwilling to tell. The silence stretched out again, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the mournful sighing of the wind as it moved through the tall pines that now began to dot the landscape. They were gaining elevation, moving deeper into the foothills of the jagged mountains, leaving the last vestiges of civilization far behind. After what felt like an eternity, Silas finally pointed ahead. His place, nestled in a small valley carved between two severe, stony hills, was a homestead. It was little more than a small log cabin and a modest, sturdy-looking barn. There was a stark, masculine tidiness to the place. The woodpile was neatly stacked, The tools by the barn wall hung in an orderly line, yet it felt profoundly unlived in, holding a deep and abiding stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath. It was a place built for sheer survival, not for comfort, and certainly not for a woman's touch. Standing on the porch of the cabin was a man. As Silas pulled the wagon to a halt, the man straightened from his position, leaning against a support beam, and watched them. This had to be Jedediah. He was as imposing as the land itself, tall and broad-shouldered. He seemed to have been hewn from the same tough material as the mountains at his back. He might have been in his early 30s, but it was hard to tell. His face, though possessed of a rugged handsomeness, was hardened by something far more damaging than sun and wind. Lines were etched around his eyes, but they were not the crinkles of laughter. They were the deep grooves of sorrow. And his eyes, they were a startlingly clear, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky, and just as cold. They held a pain so profound, so absolute, it seemed to have frozen him from the inside out. He did not smile. He did not step forward to help her down. As Alara stood on the ground, her legs unsteady, he offered only a clipped, formal nod of his head. He barely looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her once before fixing on some point in the distance beyond her shoulder. "Miss Gable," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough and unused, like stones grinding together. The tiny flame of hope that had survived the long journey sputtered and died, extinguished by the icy coldness in his eyes. There was no welcome here. There was no flicker of interest, no kindness, not even simple curiosity. There was only a shuddered, terrifying emptiness. He smelled of leather, pine, and something else, something metallic and unsettling, like old blood or sorrow that had seeped into his very skin. A portly, red-faced man whom Silas introduced as Justice Croft had ridden out with them, accompanied by his thin, weary-looking wife. The wedding ceremony was to take place immediately. There was no preamble, no moment for Alara to catch her breath or compose herself. She was hurried onto the cabin's small porch, which would serve as their altar. The vast, silent wilderness was their cathedral, the sighing wind, their choir. The justice mumbled his way through the service, his words rote and disinterested, eager to be done and on his way. Alara stood beside Jedediah, acutely aware of the rigid wall of cold that radiated from him. He stared straight ahead the entire time, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. The only witnesses were Silas, who stood with his hat in his hands and a grim expression on his face, and the justice's wife, who looked down at her shoes as if she could not bear to watch. "Do you, Alara Gable, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the justice asked, his voice impatient. Alara's throat was dry as dust. She felt 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, yoked to a stranger whose soul was a locked and bolted room. But she had nowhere else to go. Her family in Boston did not want her back. Her passage had been a one-way ticket. To run now would be to run into the arms of the unforgiving wilderness. Her "I do" was a trembling whisper, a sound so fragile it was instantly snatched away by the wind. "Do you, Jedediah, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jedediah flinched, as if the words themselves were a physical blow. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his "I do" was a harsh, choked sound, torn from his throat. "The ring," the justice prompted, sighing. Jedediah reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and produced a simple, unadorned band of dark iron. It looked more like a piece of a tool than a wedding ring. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw his hand. It was trembling violently, uncontrollably. As he took her left hand, his touch was fleeting and cold as ice, the brief contact sending a jolt of pure dread through her. He fumbled with the ring, his fingers clumsy, and slid it onto her finger. The moment felt less like a sacred union and more like the grim, final clap of a prison door. The air on the porch was thick with an unbearable, suffocating tension. a desperate primal urge to flee, to run screaming into the woods, seized her, but her feet felt as though they were nailed to the floorboards. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," the justice declared, closing his book with a snap, "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words, meant to seal a union, instead acted as a catalyst for its complete and utter destruction. The moment they were spoken, Jedediah physically recoiled from her as if he had been struck by lightning. A storm of raw, visceral pain contorted his features, erasing the handsome lines and replacing them with a mask of pure agony. His cold blue eyes, for the first time, focused directly on Alara's face, but he was not seeing her. He was looking straight through her, his gaze fixed on a ghost only he could see, a specter from a past that was clearly more real to him than the present. A strangled, guttural sound escaped his lips. He muttered a name, a single word so soft and full of anguish that it was almost lost to the wind, but Alara heard it. "Sarah," without another word, without a glance or any hint of explanation. He turned on his heel. He walked, stiff and jerky like a puppet with its strings cut, toward the side of the barn. A horse stood there, already saddled and bridled, its reins looped over a fence post. It had been prepared not for a wedding night, but for a swift departure. "Jedediah!" Silas called out, taking a step forward as if to stop him. Jedediah ignored him completely. He reached the horse and mounted it with a practiced, desperate grace, swinging his long leg over the saddle in one fluid motion. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He dug his heels hard into the horse's flanks, and the animal leaped forward, galloping away from the cabin, away from her. He disappeared over a low ridge just as the sun began to bleed its fiery red and orange across the western sky, leaving Alara standing on the porch in her wedding dress, a deserted bride. The silence that descended in his wake was stunning and absolute. It was a devastation that had no sound. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the justice cleared his throat. A small, awkward noise in the vast quiet. He and his wife, sensing a situation that was far beyond their interest or their pay, began a hasty retreat. The justice offered a few mumbled, useless words of pity that she did not hear, and his wife gave her a single, sorrowful glance before they climbed into their buggy and rattled away, leaving a small cloud of dust to mark their departure. Only Silas remained. He stood looking at her, his hard, weathered face a roadmap of conflicting emotions. She could see the anger there, a deep fury directed at the man who had just fled. But she could also see something else, something she had not seen in any eyes since she left Boston, a deep, unfamiliar, and profound pity. He walked slowly toward the porch. "I can take you back to town," he offered, his voice low. "To the boarding house. You can stay there for a spell." His tone, though not unkind, made it clear that this was a temporary solution at best. The boarding house was not a home. Alara's mind, which had been numb with shock, began to work again. She imagined arriving back in Dust Devil Creek, the object of whispers and scorn, the deserted bride. She pictured the pitying looks, the cruel speculation, the judgment in the eyes of the hard-faced women. The thought of it, of facing that public humiliation, was more than she could bear. She looked away from Silas, her gaze falling on the log cabin. It was cold, empty, and forbidding, but the justice's words echoed in her mind. It was her home now, in name, if not in spirit. Her eyes swept over the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded it, the stony hills and the endless sky. She had nothing. She was nothing. And in that moment of absolute desperation, a tiny, defiant spark ignited within her. She would not be a victim. She would not be shuffled from one pitying hand to another, a piece of unwanted baggage. She had come here for a life, and even if it was a life of solitude and hardship, it would be hers. She turned back to Silas, Her chin lifted. "I am staying," she said. Her voice was fragile, but a note of steel ran through it that surprised them both. The blacksmith stared at her, his eyes widening slightly. He had expected tears, hysterics, a complete collapse. He had not expected this quiet, resolute defiance. He searched her face, and he must have seen the truth of her decision in her eyes, because he gave a slow, long nod. He did not argue. He did not try to dissuade her. Instead, his pity transformed into a kind of grudging respect. Before he left, his actions became a lifeline. He showed her the deep, stone-lined well and how to work the crank for the bucket. He pointed out the large, neatly stacked woodpile and the axe that leaned against it. He opened the cabin door and led her into the small larder, showing her the provisions Jedediah had stocked: sacks of flour and beans, a side of salted pork, tins of coffee and sugar. His words were few, his movements all practical efficiency, but each action was a small gift of survival. "I will check on you," he said, pausing by his wagon. "In a week's time." It was a promise. Elara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as he climbed into his buckboard, clicked the reins, and drove away, the sound of his wagon wheels fading until it was swallowed completely by the immense silence. Then he too was gone, and Elara was left utterly, terrifyingly alone. The sun had vanished, and dusk was settling fast, pulling a deep purple blanket over the valley. The encroaching night brought with it a new chorus of sounds, the call of a distant owl, the rustle of some unseen creature in the brush. The wind whispered through the pines, sounding like a mournful lament for the day that had died. Behind her, the cabin door stood open, a dark, gaping mouth leading into the shadows of her new life. For a long time, Elara did not move from the porch. She remained a statue carved from shock, watching the spot on the ridge where he had vanished until the fiery sunset bled into the deep, bruised purple of twilight. The cold was what finally broke the spell, a chill that seeped through the thin serge of her dress and into her bones, with stiff, robotic movements. She turned and faced the open cabin door. It was a dark, gaping mouth, promising shadows and little else. Numb with a grief too fresh and raw to be fully felt, she forced herself to step across the threshold. The darkness that swallowed her was absolute. It was not the gentle, city-softened dark of Boston, where gas lights threw a pale yellow haze and the moon was a familiar friend. This was an ancient, ink-black darkness, a living presence that pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. As her eyes struggled to adjust, the world outside the thin cabin walls came alive with a terrifying symphony of the night. The long, mournful howl of a distant wolf raised the fine hairs on her arms. The sharp, sudden screech of an owl from a nearby pine sounded like a woman's scream. In the brush just beyond the porch, unseen creatures rustled and scurried, their movements a constant, nerve-shredding whisper, every groan of the cabin's logs settling, every tiny creak of the wood, sounded like the footstep of an intruder. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. Her hands, clumsy and shaking, fumbled in the dark for the door. She found the heavy wooden bar and, with a strength born of pure terror, lifted it and slid it into its iron brackets. The solid thud of the bar falling into place was a small, reassuring sound in the hostile dark. She stood with her back pressed against the door, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, listening. Slowly, her vision began to clear, distinguishing the deeper shadows within the gloom. The cabin was Spartan, brutally functional. It was a single, large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that stood cold and black against one wall. A rough-hewn table, solid and unadorned, sat in the center of the room, accompanied by a single, straight-backed wooden chair against the far wall. A bed was built directly into the log frame, its mattress a simple straw-filled ticking. A smaller, lean-to section off the back served as a crude kitchen area, with a dry sink and shelves for provisions. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint, layered scents of old wood smoke, worn leather, and something else, the lingering, lonely presence of Jedediah himself. It clung to the air, a ghost of a scent, masculine and sad. On a low shelf near the fireplace, she saw the glint of a bottle. Her fingers, when she reached for it, were trembling. It was a half-empty bottle of whiskey. She had never tasted spirits in her life, but the shock and the cold and the fear had hollowed her out, and she needed something, anything, to fill the void. After a moment's hesitation, she uncorked it and poured a small amount into a tin cup she found on the counter. The unaccustomed burn as it went down her throat was a sharp, grounding sensation, a point of fire in the vast, cold emptiness of the night. Her eyes fell on the bed. His bed, the bed they were supposed to share. The thought of lying there, in the space where he should have been, was unbearable. The humiliation of it, the sheer loneliness of it, was a fresh wave of pain. Instead, she took a coarse, heavy wool blanket from a peg on the wall and curled into the single wooden chair by the cold hearth. She sat there all night, rigid and alert, jumping at every skittering sound, at every howl of the wind. The simple iron wedding band on her finger felt impossibly heavy, a cold, unyielding shackle binding her to this place, to this man, to this crushing solitude. And in the long stretches between the night sounds, the silence was even more terrifying. It was a vast, empty void that pressed in on her, a perfect mirror for the profound hollowness that had opened up inside her soul. The next few days passed in a blur of desperate, clumsy activity. Survival became a brutal and immediate master, its demands so loud they momentarily drowned out the screaming grief in her mind. Her polite Boston upbringing had prepared her for managing a household, for needlepoint and polite conversation. It had not prepared her for this. It had not prepared her for the sheer physical effort required to exist. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate slide of thread through linen, were soon raw, red, and blistered from the rough handle of the heavy, unwieldy axe. She would swing it with all her might, and it would often bounce off the seasoned pine logs with a dull thud. It took her hours of grueling, frustrating labor to split enough firewood to feed the hearth. She learned to draw water from the deep, cold well, the wooden bucket impossibly heavy on the rope, her shoulders and back screaming in protest with every turn of the crank. The first few times she tried to light the fireplace, her efforts filled the small cabin with acrid, choking smoke that sent her stumbling outside, tears streaming from her stinging eyes. She took stock of the meager larder Silas had shown her and realized with a jolt of fear that she would have to ration every scrap. There were sacks of flour, dried beans, and a few dozen potatoes beginning to sprout. A large side of salted pork hung from a hook, and there were tins of coffee and a small bag of sugar. She learned to make a dense, heavy flatbread on a cast-iron skillet over the fire. The first few batches blackened on the outside and raw in the middle. The simplest tasks became monumental efforts, each one a small, hard-won victory against the wilderness and her own incompetence. The physical exhaustion was immense, a deep, aching weariness that settled into her very bones. But it was a strange sort of blessing. At the end of each day, she would collapse into the hard chair, too tired for the tears that perpetually threatened to overwhelm her, her mind too numb to dwell on the humiliation of her abandonment. In the small moments of rest, she methodically explored the cabin, searching for some clue, some hint of the man who had brought her here only to cast her aside. But the space was as shuttered and empty as his eyes had been. It was devoid of personal touches. There were no pictures, no letters, no worn books, nothing to suggest a life lived within its walls. The only exception was a small, locked wooden chest that sat at the foot of the built-in bed. It was plain, bound with iron straps, and held a sense of finality. She ran her fingers over the cool wood but made no attempt to open it. It was his, and she would respect the privacy of the man who had so thoroughly, so completely, rejected her. Her solitude was absolute. The promised week stretched before her like a barren desert. Days passed without the sight or sound of another human being. The vast, indifferent landscape became her only companion, and slowly, she began to learn its language. She learned that the sun did not simply rise. It was a daily miracle, painting the eastern peaks in breathtaking hues of rose and gold that made her heart ache with their beauty. She learned that the sunset was not an ending, but a final, defiant blaze of glory, setting the western ridge on fire before surrendering to the night. She learned the patterns of the wind, the way it whispered secrets through the pines just before a storm, and the way it howled like a banshee when a squall swept through the valley. The initial terror she had felt for the wilderness slowly began to transform into a grudging, then a profound respect. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and utterly ambivalent to her survival. But it was also honest in its brutality. It did not pretend to be something it was not. It was a stark, clean contrast to the world she had left behind. A world of quiet deceits and polite, unspoken cruelties. Here, the dangers were plain and the rules were simple. Adapt or perish. She was no longer just an observer, a fragile porcelain doll placed in a rugged setting. She was becoming a part of it, a small, resilient creature learning to endure. Behind the cabin, she discovered a small, untended vegetable patch, choked with weeds but showing the faint, green promise of a few struggling plants. She spent hours on her knees, her fingers digging deep into the cool, dark earth, pulling up the invasive weeds one by one. The simple, rhythmic act of nurturing the struggling carrots and potatoes gave her a sense of purpose, a tiny, defiant glimmer of hope that something, even here, could still be made to grow. The week passed, 7 long, silent days. On the 8th day, just as a sliver of despair began to creep into her heart, she heard the distant, welcome sound of a horse and wagon. It was Silas. The relief that washed over her was so profound it made her knees weak. His arrival broke the suffocating blanket of silence, a tangible link to a world she had begun to think she had only imagined. He found her by the woodpile, her dress torn and stained with dirt, her hair escaping its pins in wild strands, her hands calloused and scratched. He pulled his wagon to a halt and simply looked at her for a long moment. She was not the broken, weeping girl he had likely expected to find. She was thinner, harder, but there was a new, quiet determination in her eyes that had not been there before. He was visibly impressed, though his praise, when it came, was as understated as the man himself. "You are still here," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, tinged with something that sounded almost like awe. He brought supplies from town, another sack of flour, a bag of salt, and a small, precious bundle of candles. He also brought news, which he delivered in his usual clipped, reluctant manner. The town of Dust Devil Creek, he told her, was buzzing with gossip about the deserted bride. She was a subject of rampant speculation, a story told over saloon bars and general store counters. Some pitied her, others scorned her, whispering that she must have some hidden, terrible flaw to make a man flee on his very wedding day. Still others whispered that Jedediah was simply mad, a haunted man who had finally broken. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but it was quickly followed by a surprising surge of anger. Their judgment, their whispers, their pity. It all felt like a distant, irrelevant annoyance. What did they know of her struggle? What did they know of the terror of the first night, or the triumph of finally starting a fire that did not smoke, or the simple, profound peace of watching the sun rise over the mountains? Their world was no longer her world. Silas did not dwell on the gossip. His help was practical, not sentimental. He showed her how to find the faint trails of rabbits in the brush and how to properly set a snare with a piece of twine and a bent branch. He noticed a small leak in the cabin roof and, with a few shingles he had brought, climbed up and repaired it. He took the heavy axe, which felt so clumsy in her hands, and with a file from his wagon, sharpened its blade to a razor's edge. His visits became a weekly ritual, a fragile but vital link to the outside world. He never mentioned Jedediah, and she, in turn, never asked. A silent, respectful understanding grew between the gruff, old blacksmith and the young, abandoned woman. He was her teacher, her provider, and in his own quiet way, her only friend. As the weeks turned into a month, and then two, a subtle but profound transformation occurred within Alara. The soft, hopeful girl who had arrived from Boston in a faded blue dress was being burned away by the harsh Montana sun and scoured clean by the prairie wind. In her place, a new woman was being forged, quieter, tougher, and infinitely more observant. She learned to read the sky for the subtle signs of changing weather. She learned to distinguish the sharp call of a hawk from the cry of an eagle. She learned the difference between the tracks of a deer and those of a wolf. One morning, she found a rabbit, still and lifeless, in one of her snares. With trembling hands and a sick, rising gorge, she forced herself to do what was necessary, remembering Silas's brief, practical instructions. The act of skinning and cleaning the small animal was a grim, bloody rite of passage. But when she cooked the meat over the fire that evening, the simple meal was a profound victory. She had provided for herself. She had survived. The initial fear of the wilderness had been replaced by a cautious, intimate knowledge. The vast emptiness that had once terrified her now offered a strange and unexpected kind of freedom. There was no one here to judge her torn dress or her calloused hands. There were no stifling social conventions to uphold. In her solitude, for the first time in her life, she could be exactly who she was. Her inner world, however, remained a tumultuous landscape. The days were for survival, but the nights were for feeling. In the quiet evenings, sitting by the flickering light of the fire, the full weight of her grief and humiliation would return. She allowed herself to feel it then, the crushing loneliness, the phantom ache for a touch that had never come, for a single word of kindness that had never been spoken. In those quiet hours, her eyes would often drift to the western ridge, the last place she had seen him. A complicated storm of emotions would churn inside her, a burning anger at his cruelty, a deep confusion at his motives, and, most unwelcome of all, a persistent, treacherous flicker of longing in the deepest corner of her heart. The days grew shorter. The vibrant gold of the aspen trees in the valley faded to a brittle brown. The air grew a sharper edge, holding the crisp, clean bite of impending winter. One late autumn afternoon, Alara was behind the cabin, digging the last of the tough, hardy potatoes from her small garden patch, when the weather turned. The sky, which had been a clear, pale blue only an hour before, took on a bruised purple-gray color. The wind, which had been a steady whisper, began to tear through the valley with a sudden, terrifying force. She scrambled to gather her harvest, her heart beginning to pound with a primal fear of the storm's power. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, not warm, but cold as ice, splattering against the dry ground. She ran for the shelter of the cabin, barring the door just as the heavens opened. The storm was a display of nature's raw, untamable power. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a tormented spirit, and the rain lashed against the small window panes like handfuls of thrown gravel. The sounds were deafening, shaking the small structure to its very foundations. A brilliant, blinding flash of lightning illuminated the entire valley for a split second, bleaching the world in a stark, ghostly white light. It was followed almost instantly by a crack of thunder so loud, so violent, that the tin cup on her table rattled and fell to the floor. In that brief, stark flash of light, she had seen something, a figure on horseback, struggling against the driving wind and rain, heading directly towards the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat, a wild, frantic bird beating against her ribs. It was a man, hunched low over his horse's neck, his form a dark, desperate shape against the fury of the tempest. For a dizzying moment, She thought it must be Silas, caught in the storm, seeking shelter, but as the figure drew closer, stumbling through the mud and the deluge, another flash of lightning lit the sky, and in that second of perfect, terrible clarity, she recognized the broad set of the shoulders, the determined line of the head. It was not Silas. It was Jedediah. He was returning. The storm raging outside was nothing compared to the tempest that erupted inside her. It was a violent, chaotic maelstrom of every emotion she had suppressed for months. A cold wave of fear, a hot surge of protective fury, and beneath it all, a terrifying, undeniable, and utterly unwelcome surge of hope. The horse stumbled to its knees in the thick, clinging mud, its breath ragged clouds in the frigid air. Jedediah did not so much dismount as fall from the saddle, his body hitting the ground with a heavy, sodden thud. For a moment he lay there, a broken shape in the maelstrom, before pushing himself up with a groan. He was racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers, his face a pale, ghostly mask slick with rain. He staggered towards the porch, not with the long, confident stride of a man returning to his own home, but with the lurching, desperate gait of a wounded animal seeking any port in the storm. Ilara stood frozen in the open doorway, a silhouette against the warm firelight within. The wind and rain whipped around her, tearing at her dress and plastering loose strands of hair to her face. But she did not feel the cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. He was here. After months of silence, months of solitude, he was here. All the anger, all the bitter resentment she had so carefully nurtured through the long, lonely nights, rose up like bile in her throat. Her first, purest instinct was to act on that anger. Her hand clenched on the edge of the heavy wooden door, her knuckles white. It would be so easy to slam it in his face, to slide the bar into place and leave him to the mercy of the very storm he had cast her into. It would be justice. He was almost to the steps now, his head bowed against the deluge. Then, as if he felt her gaze, he looked up. His eyes, those winter blue eyes, met hers across the few feet of storm-lashed porch. And in that instant, her anger shattered. She saw not the cold, empty stranger from their wedding day. She saw a man drowning in a pain so immense, so profound, it eclipsed the fury of the storm itself. His face was gaunt, the handsome planes and angles sharpened by hardship into a mask of suffering. His lips were tinged with blue from the deep, penetrating cold. But it was his eyes that undid her. They held none of their former icy distance. Instead, they were filled with a raw, haunted look of utter, absolute despair. The storm had stripped him of his carefully constructed defenses, of his pride and his distance, leaving only the broken, hollowed-out man beneath. Her rage faltered, collapsing into a reluctant, gut-wrenching wave of pity. The woman she had been months ago might have slammed the door, but she was not that woman anymore. She was a survivor. She had learned the brutal calculus of life and death in this wilderness, the simple, overriding imperative to endure. And that instinct, the instinct to preserve life, even his, was stronger now than her desire for revenge. Wordlessly, she stepped back, pulling the door wide open. He practically collapsed over the threshold, stumbling into the room with a choked gasp. He brought the storm in with him, the biting cold, the driving rain, and the wild, wet scent of pine and ozone. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his chest heaving, water dripping from his hair and clothes to form a dark puddle on the floorboards of the small, warm space she had fought so hard to claim as her own. The hours that followed were a tense, almost silent ballet of grim necessity. Jedediah was clearly, terribly ill. A powerful fever had taken hold of him, and the shivering that racked his large frame was so intense that his teeth chattered audibly. The brief surge of strength that had carried him to her door was gone, leaving him weak and helpless. Ilara moved on pure, unthinking instinct. Her actions were mechanical, a series of tasks to perform that kept the swirling chaos of her emotions at bay. If she stopped to think, if she stopped to feel, she was not sure what she would do. So she did not stop. She pointed a rigid finger toward the hearth. "Get out of those wet clothes," she commanded. Her voice was clipped, stripped of all emotion, the voice of a stranger giving an order. She turned her back to him immediately, granting him a privacy he had not earned but which her own sense of decency demanded. Her ears burned with a strange mixture of embarrassment and anger as she heard the wet rustle of fabric, the soft squelch of his boots being pulled off, and a low groan of pain or exhaustion. She strode to the wall, pulled the coarsest, heaviest wool blanket from its peg, and, without turning around, threw it in his general direction. "There is a blanket," she said to the wall. She then turned her attention to the fire, which had dwindled to glowing embers. She stoked it mercilessly, adding log after log until it roared back to life, a hungry, crackling beast that threw flickering shadows across the walls, making the small cabin seem to dance and tremble. She filled a kettle with water from the bucket by the door and hung it on its hook over the flames. When it boiled, she made a hot, bitter brew of coffee. So strong it was nearly black. She carried the steaming tin cup to where he now huddled by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, his powerful frame seeming to shrink into itself, diminished and frail. "Drink this," she ordered. He looked up at her, his blue eyes clouded with fever, and submitted to her care with a strange, unnerving passivity. His usual imposing strength was completely gone, replaced by a childlike compliance. He took the cup in his trembling hands and drank, his gaze fixed on the flames. He did not speak a single word, and she did not ask a single question. The space between them was charged with everything that had been left unsaid for months, with all her anger, all her confusion, and all her terrible loneliness. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, her fortress of solitude, now felt claustrophobic and small, overly charged with his unwelcome, overwhelming presence. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, the fever tightened its grip on Jedediah. His carefully constructed walls, the ones he had built of silence and distance, began to crumble and fall. He drifted in and out of a delirious state, his mind caught in a terrible limbo between the present and the past. And he began to talk. His voice was rough and broken, the words tumbling out in disjointed, painful fragments. Ilara, sitting in the lone chair on the opposite side of the hearth, a silent, unwilling sentinel, became the keeper of his secrets. "The smoke," he whispered, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the ceiling. "So much smoke, can't breathe." He tossed his head back and forth against the floorboards, his body tense. He spoke of a woman, his voice softening with a tenderness that was a knife in Ilara's heart. "Sarah," he murmured. "Sarah, you have to wake up. The fire." He cried out, a raw, desperate sound of pure anguish. "Daniel, where's my boy? Daniel!" Ilara sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She was frozen, trapped by the terrible intimacy of his unraveling. Through the fever-induced confession, the dark, horrific tragedy of his past slowly, painfully pieced itself together. Sarah had been his wife, Daniel his son. He spoke of a cattle drive, of a freak spring blizzard that had trapped him in the high country for 3 days longer than expected. He spoke of riding home, of seeing the pillar of smoke from miles away, of a desperate, frantic gallop that had been too late. Just embers," he choked out, a dry sob catching in his throat. "Nothing left, nothing but the chimney stones, and the graves. They dug the graves already." Sarah and their 5-year-old son had died in a cabin fire, a fire that Jedediah, delayed by the storm, had not been there to prevent. He had returned not to his home and his family, but to smoldering ruins and the freshly turned earth of 2 small graves. He had lost his entire world in a single night of fire and smoke, The townspeople, he mumbled, had called it an accident, a stray ember from the hearth, a log rolling from the grate, a terrible, tragic accident. But in the depths of his fevered, tormented mind, Jedediah believed otherwise. He was consumed by a guilt so powerful, so absolute, that it had become the bedrock of his existence. It was his fault. If he had been home, if he had not been delayed, if he had been there, he could have saved them. That belief was a living entity inside him, a poison that had hollowed him out, scoured his soul, and frozen his heart. Ilara listened, and the last of her anger dissolved, washed away by a profound, aching sorrow. The cold, cruel man who had abandoned her on the porch did not exist. He was a phantom, a shell. The real man was this one, the one broken and burning in front of her, a man so shattered by grief that he was terrified of any connection, any flicker of human warmth, for fear of the unbearable pain of losing it all again. Suddenly, it all made a terrible kind of sense, the tormented, haunted look in his eyes on their wedding day. Marrying her, starting a new life in this very cabin. Was it built on the same land as the one that had burned? It had been a desperate, last-ditch attempt to prove he could move on, an attempt he was not nearly strong enough to see through. The act of saying, "I do," of placing that cold iron ring on her finger, must have felt like a profound and terrible betrayal of his dead wife and son. He had not been running from her. He had been running from their ghosts. She watched him as he finally fell into a fitful, twitching sleep. His face, which she had only ever seen as a hard, impenetrable mask, was softened now by fever and vulnerability. In the flickering firelight, she could see the deep lines of grief that bracketed his mouth, the lingering shadow of unspeakable loss in the hollows of his eyes. For the very first time, she saw the man, not the symbol of her own humiliation and pain, and in his profound, abject loneliness, she felt a terrible, unwelcome echo of her own. She nursed him through the long, dark night, and into the next day. The storm continued to rage outside, a constant howling reminder of their complete isolation from the rest of the world. She moved with a quiet efficiency that belied the turmoil in her heart. She bathed his hot face with cloths dipped in cool water. She managed to get a few spoonfuls of thin, salted broth between his cracked lips, and she listened to his fevered, heartbreaking ramblings. In the depths of his delirium, his mind often confused the present with the past, and her with the woman he had lost. "Sarah," he would whisper, reaching out a hand, his feverish grip surprisingly strong when it closed around her wrist. "I am so sorry. Forgive me. I should have been there. I should have saved you." These moments were agonizing for Ilara. She felt like a trespasser, an intruder in the most sacred, painful corners of his soul. Every whispered apology to his dead wife felt like a fresh wound in her own heart. Yet, when he reached for her, she did not pull her hand away. She would let him hold it, and she would murmur soothing, nonsensical words, offering a comfort she was not at all sure she had a right to give. Oddly, her touch, her presence, seemed to calm the storms within him. Late in the afternoon of the second day, as the fever finally began to break, he had a moment of true lucidity. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at her, and this time, he truly saw her. He saw Ilara, the woman he had married and abandoned, the woman who was now tending to him with a quiet, solemn grace. The shame and raw vulnerability in his gaze were devastating. "You should have left me to the storm," he rasped, his voice raw and torn. Ilara looked down at him, her expression unreadable. She thought of the long months, of her fear and her anger and her loneliness. She thought of the woman she had become. "I left you," she replied, her own voice quiet but perfectly steady. "And I stayed." The simple, stark exchange hung in the air between them, a testament to all her newfound strength and all his ruin. The breaking of the fever marked a significant turning point, both inside the cabin and out. As Jedediah's temperature slowly returned to normal, the fury of the storm began to subside. The shrieking wind gentled into a whisper, and the lashing rain softened, first to a drizzle, and then to a silent, heavy fall of snow. By morning, the world outside was washed clean and utterly silent, blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of early snow. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted as well. The raw, delirious confession was over, replaced by a heavy, fragile silence that was in some ways more difficult than the storm had been. Jedediah was awake, lucid, but so weak he could barely lift his head. The weight of what he had revealed in his fever, of the secrets she now held, hung between them like a shroud. He was deeply, profoundly ashamed, unable to meet her gaze. He would stare at the fire, at his hands, at the rough log walls, anywhere but at her. He was her husband in name, the owner of this cabin, this land. Yet he was an intruder in the home she had made, a patient completely dependent on the care of the woman he had wronged so profoundly. And Elara, in turn, was no longer just the deserted bride. She was the witness to his deepest trauma, the keeper of his most terrible pain. This shared, unwilling knowledge had created a strange, unwelcome intimacy between them that neither knew how to navigate. She continued to care for him, her movements efficient and detached. She changed the damp linens on the bed where she had finally moved him. She prepared simple, nourishing food. She kept the fire blazing against the deep cold that had settled in the storm's wake. But underneath the surface of her calm, practical actions, a complex emotional storm was brewing. She was grappling with a dizzying mix of pity for his past, a lingering anger for her own, and a nascent, terrifying empathy for this broken man who was her husband. The shadows in the cabin no longer seemed empty. They seemed to be filled with ghosts, with the weight of unspoken words, and with the first tentative and deeply uncertain possibility of a connection forged in the very heart of a shared and desolate storm. The days that followed the storm were a slow, suffocating crawl through time. The world outside was a silent, pristine expanse of white. The snow lay thick and deep in the valley, a beautiful, impassable blanket that trapped them together in the small cabin. Jedediah, though the fever had left him, was still weak, his body hollowed out by the illness. He was in no condition to travel, and even if he were, the snow had made it impossible. They were prisoners of the weather, locked in a cell of logs and silence. The cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary to Elara, now seemed to shrink with each passing hour, the walls pressing in on them. The silence was no longer empty, as it had been during her months of solitude. It was fraught with the weight of everything that had happened, with everything that remained unspoken. It was a living thing, a third presence in the room, thick with his shame and her confusion. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. Two celestial bodies caught in a strange, unwilling orbit. They were acutely, painfully aware of every breath, every small movement, the scrape of a chair on the floor, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of a blanket. Each small sound was amplified in the tense quiet, charged with a significance it did not deserve. Elara clung to her daily routines as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood, tending the fire, kneading the dough for their daily bread, checking the snares she had set at the edge of the woods. These familiar tasks were her anchor in a turbulent emotional sea. She performed them with a rigid, methodical focus, a way to build a wall against the overwhelming presence of the man who was her husband and yet a complete stranger. From his seat by the fire, or from the bed where he spent much of the day resting, Jedediah watched her. His gaze was a constant, unnerving presence at her back, filled with a mixture of emotions she could not yet decipher, awe and a shame so profound it was painful to witness. He watched her hands, no longer the soft, pale hands of a Boston lady, but chapped, calloused, and capable. He saw the quiet competence with which she moved about the homestead he had abandoned her to, the way she split kindling with a sure, practiced stroke, the way she could gauge the heat of the fire with a glance. He saw the strength she had cultivated in his absence, a quiet, resilient power forged in fear and solitude, and every manifestation of it served as a constant, silent rebuke. It was a testament to her endurance and to his catastrophic failure. He was a guest in his own home, a convalescent in the care of a stranger who wore his ring. Slowly, tentatively, like the first green shoots pushing through the frozen earth of spring, words began to fill the silence. It started with practicalities, safe and impersonal. Jedediah, his strength gradually returning, finally rose from his chair one afternoon and took the axe from her hands as she prepared to chop more wood. His movements were still stiff, his face pale with the effort. "Let me," he said, his voice still rough. Ilara hesitated, then gave a single, curt nod and stepped aside. She watched as he swung the axe, the clean bite of the blade into the wood, a sharp, definitive sound in the crisp air. The shared labor, the simple rhythm of him splitting and her stacking, created a small, neutral ground between them, a place where they could exist without the crushing weight of the past. Later, sitting by the fire, he broke a longer silence. "How did you manage?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the flames. She told him. Her voice was flat and factual, stripped of accusation or embellishment. She spoke of Silas's first visit, of his promise to return. She told him of her first clumsy attempts at setting a snare, and the grim, bloody business of learning to prepare the rabbit she eventually caught. She mentioned the leaky roof and how Silas had fixed it. She did not speak of her fear, of the terror of the long, dark nights, or of the profound, soul-crushing loneliness. She did not have to. The simple, unadorned facts of her survival were a more powerful indictment than any tirade could be. Each detail of her struggle was a testament to his abandonment, a quiet monument to his failure. He listened without interruption, his face a mask of stone. When she was finished, he did not offer apologies or excuses. Instead, he began to speak of his own past, not in the delirious, fragmented ramblings of his fever, but in quiet, halting sentences, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. He told her about Sarah. He spoke of her laughter, how it had sounded like wind chimes in the summer, and of the way she loved the purple wildflowers that grew in the meadow in the spring. He told her about his son, Daniel, a boy with a wild thatch of black hair and his mother's bright eyes. He spoke of teaching the boy to ride on a small, steady pony, of the feel of those small hands gripping the saddle horn, of a future that had stretched before him, bright and full of promise. Then he spoke of the fire. He spoke of the guilt that was a constant, living thing inside him, a cold knot that never dissolved. And he told her of the vow he had made, standing over their graves, the vow to never again allow himself to care for another living soul, to never again risk the kind of pain that could hollow a man out and leave him a walking ghost. "Marrying you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "was a foolish, desperate thing. I thought maybe I could prove to myself I was not already dead inside. A last try to be a man again." He finally risked a glance at her, his blue eyes filled with a self-loathing that was absolute. It failed. The moment the justice said those words, the moment I put that ring on your finger, it was like betraying them all over again. I could not do it. I could not bring another woman into this cursed place. One evening, days later, the emotional dam that had held for so long finally broke. The tension in the cabin had become a palpable thing, a physical pressure in the air. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to mock their stillness. Jedediah had been telling her another story about Daniel, a small, happy memory that was so filled with pain it was almost unbearable to hear. Ilara, pushed to her absolute limit by the constant, suffocating tension and his painful, heartbreaking confessions, finally confronted him. She did not yell. She did not scream. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and quiet, but it trembled with the force of months of pent-up pain and rage. "Did you ever once think of me?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. "The woman you left standing on this porch, in a wedding dress. Did you ever wonder if I would freeze to death, or starve, or simply go mad from the silence?" Her questions were not sharp. They were heavy, like stones, and each one landed with a dull, sickening thud in the space between them. "I was not a ghost, Jedediah. I was a person. A young woman 1,000 miles from home with nothing but a silver locket and a valise full of worn-out clothes. Did you think of me at all?" She told him everything then. She spoke of the terror of that first night, of the sound of the wolves, of her conviction that she would be dead by morning. She told him of her loneliness, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish the very breath from her lungs. She spoke of the humiliation, of the knowledge that an entire town was whispering about her, pitying her, scorning her. She spoke of the crushing, overwhelming feeling of being utterly, completely alone in a world that did not want her. Jedediah did not flinch. He did not offer excuses. He did not look away. He sat and took every word, his face a mask of profound self-loathing, his own pain a stark and silent witness to hers. When she was finished, the words having poured out of her until she was empty and hollow, hot tears were streaming down her face, the first tears she had allowed herself to cry since her arrival. He finally looked at her, his own eyes glistening in the firelight. "Every day," he said, his voice thick and choked with an emotion she could not name. "Every single day I thought of you." He took a ragged breath. "I would see your face, standing on that porch, so scared. And every day I told myself you were better off without a cursed man like me bringing his ghosts and his misery into your life. Better off finding your way back to civilization than being shackled to a dead man." He confessed that he had not ridden far. He had spent the past months working at a remote logging camp, high in the mountains, losing himself in the brutal, mind-numbing labor of felling trees, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past and the new ghost of her face. But it had been no use. The memory of her, so fragile and so brave, had haunted him more than any specter. The storm, he admitted, had been an excuse. He had been sick, yes, but more than that. He had been broken. He had come back not just for shelter from the rain, but from a desperate, half-conscious, and deeply ashamed need to see if she was still alive. That raw, painful honesty, offered without defense or justification, shattered the last of the invisible barriers between them. The shared vulnerability, the laying bare of their deepest wounds, created a new, fragile kind of intimacy. They were no longer simply the deserter and the deserted. They were two profoundly lonely souls, scarred and battered by life, trapped in a snowbound cabin together. In the days that followed that conversation, the very air in the cabin changed. The physical awareness between them, long suppressed by anger and grief, now hummed in the small space, undeniable and intense. They found themselves watching each other in unguarded moments. He would watch the way the firelight caught the red-gold highlights in her hair as she bent over her mending. She would watch his hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, as they moved with a surprising gentleness to mend a piece of leather tack. One afternoon, they both reached for the iron kettle at the same time, and the backs of their hands brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, but a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through both of them. They pulled back as if burned, their eyes meeting for a split second before darting away. The desire that flared in that moment was terrifying for them both. For Jedediah, it felt like a profound betrayal of Sarah, a breaking of the sacred vow he had made over her grave. For Alara, it was a confusing, chaotic mix of her body's natural, lonely longing and a deep-seated, rational fear of being hurt again, of giving any part of herself to a man who had already proven he could leave her cold. The emotional and physical climax came on a particularly cold night. A deep, penetrating chill had settled over the valley, the kind of cold that seeped through the log walls and made the very air feel brittle. Despite the roaring fire in the hearth, the cabin was frigid. They had been existing in this state of heightened, unspoken tension for days, the air thick with a longing that neither dared to acknowledge. Ilara could not sleep. She lay in the single chair, wrapped in her blankets, her mind racing. Finally, she rose and went to the hearth to add another log to the fire, the simple action a release for her restless energy. As she knelt, carefully placing the log on the embers, she felt his presence behind her. It was not a sound, but a shift in the air, a warmth at her back. She turned her head, and he was standing there, just a few feet away. His face was illuminated by the leaping flames, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hunger that was a perfect mirror of her own. He did not speak. He simply reached out a hand and gently, tentatively, touched her cheek. His thumb, calloused and rough, traced the line of her jaw with an impossible tenderness. The simple touch was electric, a spark in the tinder, dry atmosphere of the cabin. All the fear, all the anger, all the desperate loneliness of the past months welled up inside her, and a single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her skin. "Do not," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Do not touch me if you are just going to leave again." He looked at her, his own expression one of pure, unadulterated anguish. "I cannot," he said, his voice a raw whisper, torn from his throat. "I cannot promise." But his words were cut short, rising on her toes. She closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not gentle. It was not tender. It was a desperate, hungry collision, fueled by months of solitude and violently suppressed emotion. It was a kiss of anger and of forgiveness, of shared pain and of profound, aching longing. In that moment, the past with its ghosts and the future with its fears ceased to exist. There was only the here and the now, the warmth of the fire on their skin, and the overwhelming, undeniable need for human connection. He responded with a groan that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. His arms, powerful and trembling, wrapped around her, pulling her tight against his chest as if he were afraid she might dissolve into smoke and disappear. He held her as if he were drowning and she were the last solid thing in the world. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her the few short steps to the bed built into the wall. As he laid her down on the rough blankets, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his in the flickering firelight. "Do not leave me cold again," she cried, the words a raw, vulnerable plea that encapsulated all her fear and all her hope. He looked down at her, and she could see the terrible conflict warring in his eyes, the ghosts of his past fighting against the needs of the present, but his overwhelming need for her, for this single, incandescent moment of warmth and life in the midst of his cold, dead world, finally won out. He came down to her, pulling the rough blankets over them both, and in the deep shadows of the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of what was and the uncertainty of what might be, they finally, completely, came together. Their union was not just a physical act. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to chase away the darkness, to find a moment of solace and life in a world that had given them both so much pain. It was a fragile, uncertain beginning, born not of promises or vows, but of a shared, profound, and undeniable need to no longer be alone. The morning after their night together dawned cold and brilliantly clear, the sun casting long blue shadows across the snow. Inside the cabin, the new day was not filled with romantic bliss, but with a fragile, uncertain, and deeply awkward new reality. The act of coming together had not solved their problems. It had simply and irrevocably changed them. The silence that had once been heavy with grief and anger was now replaced by a tender, painful shyness. For Ilara, the fear of abandonment, which had been a dull ache for months, was now a sharp and palpable presence. It was a cold shadow that lurked at the very edge of the new, tentative warmth she felt. She had given him the last of her vulnerability, and the terror of having him reject it, of having him leave her cold once more, was a constant, sickening knot in her stomach. She watched his every move, his every expression, searching for a sign, a clue as to whether he would stay or flee again. For Jedediah, the guilt was immense, waking up with her sleeping beside him, her hair a dark tumble on the rough pillow, had been both a miracle and a torment. He felt as though he had committed a profound betrayal against the memory of Sarah, of the life that had been burned to ashes, yet his body and soul, starved for so long, craved the connection he had found with Alara, the warmth of her skin, the simple, solid presence of another human being beside him in the dark, was a balm to his frozen heart. He was a man caught between the ghosts of his past and the fragile promise of a future, and the conflict was a quiet agony. The deep snow continued to keep them isolated, creating a temporary, unnatural bubble where they could exist only with and for each other, in this cocoon, sealed off from the judgment of the world. Their relationship began to tentatively, cautiously grow. They began to talk more freely, the words no longer just about survival or the painful confessions of the past. They shared stories of their childhoods, two lives so different they might have come from different worlds. She spoke of her constrained, proper upbringing in Boston, a world of cobblestone streets, strict etiquette, and the ever-present, genteel pressure of keeping up appearances. He, in turn, described a wild, free youth spent in the mountains, learning to hunt and track from his father, a life dictated by the seasons and the harsh, honest laws of nature. They began to build a life in miniature, the two of them falling into a quiet, unspoken domestic rhythm. One afternoon, he took his rifle down from the pegs on the wall. It was a heavy, beautiful weapon of dark wood and blued steel. He took her outside into the blinding white sunlight and, with a gentle patience that startled her, began to teach her how to shoot. He stood behind her, his hands covering hers to show her how to hold the heavy stock, his chest a warm, solid presence against her back. He spoke in a low voice, his breath warm against her ear, telling her how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. When she finally fired, the powerful kick of the rifle jarring her shoulder, and the shot struck a snow-laden branch and sent a shower of white to the ground. A small, rare smile touched his lips. In the evenings, after their simple meal, she would read to him. She had brought only 2 books with her in her small valise, a collection of poems and a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays. She would read by the flickering light of the fire, her voice a soft, soothing balm in the deep, profound quiet of the cabin. He would sit in the shadows, listening, his face unreadable, but she knew he was hearing more than just the words. In these small moments of shared experience, the smell of gun smoke in the cold air, the shared meal, the rise and fall of her voice in the firelight, they began to weave a delicate, intricate tapestry of intimacy. It was a bond that went deeper than just shared desire or shared trauma. It was the fragile, uncertain beginning of something new. Just as they began to find a semblance of this fragile peace, the outside world intruded, the weather warmed, and the deep snow began to melt, first turning to slush and then revealing the muddy, brown earth beneath. Their isolation was broken by the sound of an approaching wagon. It was Silas. The old blacksmith pulled his team to a halt and sat for a moment, his gaze taking in the scene. He saw Jedediah, standing on the porch, looking healthier and stronger, but with the haunted look still lingering deep in his eyes. He saw Alara, who came to stand beside Jedediah, not behind him, carrying herself with a new, quiet confidence. A slow, knowing look passed over the blacksmith's weathered face, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He brought them much-needed supplies, but he also brought unwelcome news from Dust Devil Creek. His face was grim as he told them. A man named Marcus Thorne, a wealthy and powerful rancher whose land bordered Jedediah's, had taken a keen interest in this small valley. Thorn was a man known for his ruthlessness and his burning ambition to own every acre, every drop of water. In the region, the creek that ran through Jedediah's property, Silas explained, was the most reliable water source for miles, especially in the dry summer months. Thorn had assumed Jedediah had abandoned the claim for good after he disappeared and had already begun making legal inquiries to have the land declared forfeit. Jedediah's sudden return and the presence of a wife to solidify the claim had complicated Thorn's plans. "He is not a man to be trifled with, Jedediah," Silas warned, his voice low and serious. "He does not take kindly to being thwarted. He will not give up his ambition easily." Marcus Thorn soon became more than just a name. He became the primary antagonist in their fragile story, a physical embodiment of the social prejudice and naked greed that threatened their happiness. A week after Silas's visit, he paid them a visit himself. He rode in on a magnificent black horse with a silver-inlaid saddle, a stark contrast to their own humble existence. Thorn himself was a man in his 40s, handsome in a predatory way, well-dressed in a tailored coat and clean, polished boots. His demeanor was a thin veneer of civility stretched taut over a core of pure menace. He dismounted and strode onto their porch as if he owned it. He ignored Jedediah at first, turning his smooth, charming smile on Alara. "Mrs. Jedediah," he said, his voice like honey laced with poison. He addressed her with a patronizing, insulting pity, his eyes raking over her worn dress and the simple cabin. "The famous abandoned bride. The whole territory is talking about you. It is a pleasure to finally meet the woman who could bring our local hermit back from the dead." He went on, implying that she deserved far better than this rough cabin and a broken-down recluse like Jedediah. He then turned to Jedediah, his smile never wavering, and made a low, insulting offer to buy the ranch. He framed it as a kindness, a chance for them to escape the gossip and start over somewhere else, somewhere more civilized. Jedediah stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The land is not for sale," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Thorn's mask of civility slipped, the smile vanished, and his eyes turned as cold and hard as river stones. He let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "This land has a way of swallowing people up," he said, his words hanging in the air like a curse. "It is a hard place, especially for people who are all alone out here, with no friends to speak of." He gave Alara one last dismissive glance, then turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a palpable chill in his wake. The confrontation solidified Jedediah's resolve. This was no longer just about holding onto his property. To the last remnant of his past, it was about protecting Alara. It was about protecting the new, fragile life they were so cautiously trying to build together. Thorn began a quiet, insidious campaign of harassment designed to break their will and drive them out. The acts were small, deniable, but constant. One morning, they awoke to find that one of Thorn's ranch hands had accidentally driven a small herd of cattle through their small vegetable patch, the one Alara had worked so hard to nurture. The tender green shoots were trampled into the mud, the promise of fresh food for the coming months ruined. A few days later, they found a section of their fence cut, the crude wire that enclosed their small pasture snipped clean through, allowing their 2 milk cows to wander off. It took Jedediah a full day of tracking to find them. These were acts of aggression disguised as accidents, a constant source of stress and hardship. The community in Dust Devil Creek, which had always been wary of the haunted man in the hills, sided entirely with Thorn. He was a pillar of their small society, a man of wealth and influence who bought rounds at the saloon and donated to the church. Jedediah was the town madman, and Alara, by extension, was the scandalous, foolish woman who was living with him. When they had to ride into town for supplies, they could not make or grow themselves. They were met with a wall of cold shoulders and hostile stares. The store owner, a man who bowed and scraped before Marcus Thorn, suddenly found reasons to overcharge them for flour and salt, People would stop talking when they entered a room, their conversations replaced by whispers and speculative glances. The social ostracism was a painful and constant reminder of their precarious position. They had no one to rely on but each other and the loyal, taciturn Silas, who would visit them under the cover of dusk, bringing what supplies he could and sharing what little news he had. The conflict escalated from a cold war to a hot one on a late summer afternoon. Jedediah had ridden out to check a far section of his property line, near the creek that Thorn so coveted. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon and he did not return, a cold knot of fear began to tighten in Alara's stomach. This was not like him. He was always back before dusk, overcoming the wave of fear that threatened to paralyze her. She took the rifle from the wall. Her hands were steady. She lit a lantern, even though it was not yet fully dark, and went outside. She found his horse's tracks easily in the soft earth near the creek and began to follow them. The sight that met her in a small, secluded clearing by the water was a horrifying echo of the night she had found him in the storm. He was lying on the ground, his face a bloody mask. Two men, rough-looking men she recognized as Thorn's ranch hands, were standing over him. The fight had been brutal and uneven. Jedediah was a capable and powerful fighter, but he had been outnumbered. He had been beaten badly. As Alara watched from the cover of the trees, he managed to fight his way to his feet, his fury giving him a last surge of strength, and he drove the men back. They had not intended to kill him, only to beat him into submission, to teach him a lesson. Seeing him rise, bloody but unbroken, they seemed to decide their work was done. They mounted their horses and galloped away, laughing. Jedediah stood swaying for a moment, then collapsed to his knees, his head hanging. Alara ran to him. The sight of him, broken and bleeding by the creek, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. He was conscious, but barely. There was a deep, ugly gash on his forehead, and when she helped him to his feet, he cried out in pain, his hand going to his side where a rib was clearly broken. That event, that brutal act of violence, became the final, clarifying turning point. As Alara tended to Jedediah's wounds back at the cabin, her hands gentle but sure as she cleaned the blood from his face. All her remaining fear and hesitation were burned away, consumed by a fierce, protective rage. The timid woman who had once been afraid of being abandoned was gone forever. Now, she was terrified of losing him. And Jedediah, his head cradled in her lap, looked up at her face in the lamplight. He saw the tears glistening in her eyes, but he also saw the hard, determined set of her jaw. He saw the fear and the love warring in her expression, and in that moment, he finally, fully understood the depth of his own feelings. The love he felt for her was not a betrayal of his past. It was a testament to his ability to live again. It was a different kind of love from the one he had shared with Sarah, quieter, harder won, forged in the crucible of survival and shared pain, but it was just as real and just as powerful. As she gently dabbed at the gash on his forehead with a wet cloth, he reached up and caught her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. She looked down at him, her heart stopping for a beat. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice a hoarse, ragged promise that was more sacred than any vow spoken before a justice. "I am not going anywhere. This is our home." In that moment of shared crisis, they were no longer two broken individuals huddled together for warmth. They were a single, unified force. They both knew that Thorn would not stop, that the beating was just a beginning. They knew that justice would not be found in the town's courthouse, in the pocket of a wealthy rancher. They would have to find their own way to fight back. They would have to find a way to protect their home, their land, and the fierce, fragile love that had taken root in the coldest of places. The aftermath of the attack marked not an end, but a beginning. Jedediah's promise, spoken through bruised lips in the dim light of the cabin, was the foundation upon which they built their unified stand. His recovery was slow and painful. The broken rib made every breath a sharp agony. and the gash on his forehead left a raw, angry scar that would forever serve as a reminder of their fight. During this time, the roles between them were completely reversed. He, the strong and self-sufficient man of the mountains, was now the one who was vulnerable, dependent, and Ilara, the woman he had once seen as a fragile creature from another world, became his constant, vigilant nurse, his unwavering source of strength. This period of forced quiet and shared purpose solidified their partnership in a way that months of peace never could have. The tender, uncertain intimacy that had been born in the snowbound cabin now hardened into a bond of tempered steel. They spent the long hours of his convalescence not in silence, but in planning. Their conversations, held in low, intense voices in the flickering firelight, were the careful strategies of two soldiers preparing for a war they could not afford to lose. They both knew they could not appeal to the law. The town sheriff, a man named Gable with a paunch and a weak chin, was firmly in Marcus Thorne's pocket, a fact known to everyone in Dust Devil Creek. To ask for his help would be to announce their next move directly to their enemy. They were utterly on their own. They realized that Thorne's power was twofold. It came from his wealth, the massive cattle operation that made lesser men dependent on his goodwill, and it came from his reputation as an untouchable pillar of the community. Their only hope was to find a way to strike at the very source of that power, to find a leverage point so undeniable that even a paid-off lawman could not ignore it, a truth so stark that the community could not dismiss it. It was Jedediah who provided the key. From his years of living in these hills, from the half-heard whispers in town and the guarded conversations of men he had known, he had a deep and abiding suspicion about how Marcus Thorne had built his empire so quickly. He did not buy out the Millers or the Jensens, Jedediah said one evening, his voice a low growl of conviction. He broke them, drove them off, and I would wager my life their cattle never left this valley. He believed Thorne had been systematically rustling unbranded strays and, more brazenly, altering the brands of smaller ranchers he had driven out of business. Their goal became clear, a single point of light in the darkness. They had to find irrefutable proof. Their fight for justice forced them to rely on their intimate knowledge of the harsh, beautiful landscape that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. While Jedediah's ribs slowly mended, Ilara took on the dangerous task of reconnaissance. The rifle he had taught her to use was no longer a novelty. It was an extension of her arm, a tool of survival. She began to make careful, secretive trips deep into the rugged back country, the wild, untamed land that separated their small valley from the main pastures of Thorne's sprawling ranch. The woman who had once trembled at the howl of a wolf now moved like a ghost through a landscape that was no longer alien to her. Her senses, honed by months of solitude and survival, were preternaturally sharp. She could read the meaning in a bent twig, a dislodged stone, the distant call of a nervous bird. She learned the terrain with an intimacy born of necessity, memorizing the hidden canyons, the secret game trails, the places where a person could see without being seen. Her journey was fraught with peril. A single wrong step on the loose shale of a steep hillside could mean a fatal fall. Discovery by Thorne's men, who patrolled his borders with a proprietary arrogance, would be even worse. Yet, she moved with a quiet, fearless determination, her purpose a shield against the danger. During one of these expeditions, after days of fruitless searching, she found it. Tucked away in the back of a series of winding, rocky ravines was a hidden, isolated box canyon. Its entrance so narrow and choked with brush that it was nearly invisible, and inside, grazing on the sparse grass, was a small herd of about 30 cattle. From a high, protected ledge, she watched them through the small spyglass Silas had quietly provided. Upon closer inspection, she saw exactly what they had been looking for. The brands on the animals' hides were a mess. Thorne's brand was there, but it was fresh, the scar tissue still pink and raw, and beneath it, she could just make out the crude, burned-over remnants of an older, Different brand. It was the Simplum J of the Miller-Jensen family, a family that had mysteriously packed up and left the territory the previous year. Their land and assets bought out by Thorne for pennies on the dollar. This was it. This was the proof they needed. The plan they devised back in the firelit cabin was risky, audacious, and required perfect execution. Proof was not enough. They needed a witness, an arbiter of the law who was beyond Marcus Thorne's corrupting influence. Jedediah, his mind clear and focused, remembered a federal marshal, a hard but scrupulously fair man named Elias Vance, who passed through the territory on a circuit every few months. Vance was a legend in the territory, a man who feared no one and who could not be bought. Their plan was to lure Thorne and his men to the hidden canyon at the exact time they knew Marshal Vance would be passing through the area. Through Silas, they sent word to a trusted long-haul freighter, a friend of the blacksmiths, to deliver a message to the marshal in the next town on his circuit. The message was vague but urgent, speaking of a land and property dispute that was about to turn violent and required a federal presence. They carefully calculated the timing, giving the marshal just enough time to arrive. Then, Jedediah, now mostly healed and moving with only a slight stiffness, rode into Dust Devil Creek to set the bait. He went to the saloon, a place he had not set foot in for years, and let it slip to a known gossip who was also one of Thorne's spies. He spoke loudly of having found a small herd of stray cattle in the back country, unbranded and ripe for the claiming. He announced his intention to drive them down to his own pasture in 2 days' time. The bait was set. Thorne, as they knew he would be, was too arrogant and too greedy to let one of his hired hands handle the situation. He could not resist the urge to personally confront and humiliate the broken-down recluse who had dared to defy him. The final confrontation took place in the stark, unforgiving landscape of the Box Canyon. The sun beat down from a pitiless sky, baking the rocks and raising a shimmering heat from the canyon floor. Thorne and a half-dozen of his men rode into the narrow entrance, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. They were expecting to find Jedediah alone, to corner him and beat him into submission once and for all. Instead, they found him waiting for them, standing calm and resolute in the center of the canyon, and beside him, her feet planted firmly, was Ilara, his heavy rifle held in her hands with a familiarity that was both shocking and unnerving. Her presence, her quiet defiance, seemed to infuriate Thorne more than anything else. "Well, well," Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he swung down from his horse. "The happy couple, playing rancher, I have come for my cattle, Jedediah, and to teach you a final lesson about trespassing." The tense standoff was broken by the sound of more approaching horses. Marcus Thorne's face, which had been a mask of smug arrogance, shifted to confusion, then to shock as Marshal Elias Vance rode into the canyon, his silver star glinting in the sun. Beside him, holding a shotgun, was Silas. "Marshal Vance," Thorne stammered, his face paling. "What a surprise. This is a private matter." "It stopped being a private matter when you started stealing cattle." "Thorne," Jedediah said, his voice calm and clear. He presented his case to the marshal, pointing to the small herd of cattle, to the crudely doctored brands, to the clear evidence of theft. The proof was undeniable, burned into the hides of the animals themselves. Thorne, trapped and desperate, tried to bluster his way out. He tried to bribe the marshal, his voice a low, wheedling whisper. But Elias Vance was incorruptible. He looked at Thorne with an expression of pure, cold disgust. In a final, foolish act of violent desperation, Thorne's hand darted to the pistol at his hip, but before he could even clear the holster, Ilara moved. She raised the rifle to her shoulder with a swift, decisive motion that was as natural as breathing. She did not aim at him. She aimed at the ground. She fired a single, warning shot that kicked up a violent spray of dirt and gravel just inches from his polished boots. The sound of the shot echoed off the canyon walls, a definitive, deafening roar. Her action was swift, unwavering, and utterly resolute. She was not the timid girl from Boston anymore. She was a woman of the West, a woman defending her home, her man, and the life they had built. Thorne froze, his hand hovering over his gun, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. His men, seeing the cold, hard look in the marshal's eyes and the unwavering aim of the woman with the rifle, slowly raised their hands. Justice, in the end, did not come from the community that had scorned them. It was imposed upon it by an outside force, as stark and uncompromising as the landscape itself. The story of Jedediah and Alara did not end there. With a simple, happy resolution, the arrest of Marcus Thorne sent shockwaves through Dust Devil Creek, but it did not instantly erase the years of prejudice and mistrust. In the eyes of the town, they were still outsiders, the cause of the upheaval that had brought down one of their own. They were respected now, but it was a respect born of fear of the law, not of genuine acceptance. They came to realize that their home would never be in the town. Among other people, their home was the small log cabin, the quiet valley, the wild and beautiful land that they had fought for and bled on. And this realization was not a sad one, but a freeing one. They had each other. They had the land. And that was more than enough. They had faced the ghosts of the past and the malice of the present, and they had not only survived, but they had forged a bond so strong it could never be broken. The final scenes of their story were not written in grand, dramatic events, but in small, quiet moments. They were written in the way they worked side by side, their movements synchronized in a comfortable, familiar rhythm. As they rebuilt the section of fence that Thorne's men had cut, they were written in the way they knelt together in the rich, dark earth, planting a new garden where the old one had been trampled, a quiet act of faith in the future. The dark tragedy of Jedediah's past was not forgotten. It had become a part of the foundation of their relationship, a shared scar that had, in its own way, brought them closer. One cool autumn afternoon, he took her by the hand and led her to a quiet, sun-dappled clearing a short walk from the cabin. There, beneath a towering pine, were two simple, weathered wooden crosses. It was the place where his first cabin had burned, the place where Sarah and Daniel were buried. He stood before the graves, holding her hand, and he spoke to them. His voice was quiet, filled not with the raw anguish of before, but with a deep and abiding peace. He introduced Alara, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as the woman who had brought him back to life, who had taught his frozen heart how to feel again. It was a moment of profound healing, of quiet, solemn acceptance. The story closes one evening as they sit together on the porch of the cabin, the very same porch where he had left her standing alone in her wedding dress. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, casting a warm, golden light over their valley. The shadows were beginning to lengthen, stretching their long fingers across the land. But they were no longer threatening. They were just the soft, gentle harbingers of a peaceful night. Jedediah reached for Alara's hand, his touch now warm and sure and full of unspoken promises. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the simple, dark iron wedding band that he had once placed on her finger with such dread. It was no longer a shackle, a symbol of a grim transaction. It was a circle, a symbol of a love that had weathered the coldest of storms. They did not need grand declarations or flowery promises. Their love was written in their shared survival, in the quiet, resilient strength of their clasped hands. They had found their peace not in forgetting the cold, but in their unwavering resolve to create a lasting warmth, a home for their two lonely hearts in the vast, wild, and beautiful emptiness of the West. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.